Hey folks, welcome back to my channel. Today we are delving deep into the world of Jimi Hendrix's fuzz pedals. We are going to trace Jimi's fuzz journey, listen to these fuzzes one by one and then compare them to each other. I've done some research, I mixed in personal insights and assumptions and referenced some famous performances. Now I should mention that I'll be demonstrating these fuzz sounds with my maple neck Stratocaster. But here's the cool part. Jimi's transition to maple neck strats in his later career is where we find his most interesting sounds due to my understanding. We explore these fuzz types and aim to capture their essence rather than recreate these sounds exactly. So generally, Jimi Hendrix dabbled with two types of fuzz pedals. Those based on germanium transistors and those based on silicon transistors. In November 1966, Jimi Hendrix, now situated in the UK, in London, got his hands on the brand new Dallas Arbiter fuzz face with AC 128 germanium transistors, which he continued to occasionally use throughout his entire career. Jimi's first recordings with fuzz can be heard on the song Love or Confusion of his debut album Are You Experienced, released in May 1967. Jimi's breakthrough in the United States happened at the Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967, where he used a germanium fuzz face exclusively, leaving an incredible mark on rock music. Many of the later fuzz phases, the germanium fuzz phases that Jimi Hendrix used, were then no longer based on the AC 128 transistor, but on the infamous NKT 275. In November 2017, one of his original Dallas Arbiter fuzz faces was auctioned for about $40,000. Right in the beginning of the year 1967, to be exact, in January, Jimi met a guy called Roger Mayer. At that time, Roger Mayer, a British guy, was working for the British military, and Jimi often called him Roger Valve. With Roger Mayer's involvement in Jimi's sound, things got wild. Not just in terms of sound, but also in terms of modifying the stock Arbiter fuzz faces. Jimi and Roger would buy lots of stock fuzzes and test them. They kept the best sounding ones and then they modified them. And this makes it just a little harder to distinguish between the units that carried Roger's modifications and the regular stock units just by looking at photos or watching videos. Come December 1967, Jimi Hendrix has just released his album Axis Bold as Love. From that point on, the Axis fuzz really became a staple in his live sound. It was constructed with European PNP and NPN low noise silicon transistors. It's likely that the Axis circuit evolved over the years, reaching its prime around 1969 to 1970. The key modifications of the Axis fuzz were a change in the gain structure. They had more gain, and the most important change was that Roger made the Axis fuzz work with the Wah Wah pedal. Because Jimmy loved to go wah wah first and then into his fuzz. And usually when using a germanium fuzz or especially a silicon fuzz, you have oscillation problems once you kick in the wah wah pedal. A wah wah pedal with the fuzz working after it is actually a pretty good indication to detect a modded fuzz in Jimmy's setup. Moving into October 1968, Jimmy has released Electric Ladyland, an album that's hard to pin down in terms of the fuzzes or the fuzz used primarily on that record. At that time, fuzz phases fuzzes were generally in a kind of transition from germanium to silicon, with Jimi Hendrix gradually favoring silicon fuzzes. Let's listen to some Electric Ladyland-like sounds, on the one hand with the germanium fuzz and on the other hand with the Axis fuzz. January 1969, Jimi Hendrix went on a European tour. Some of the live recordings and bootlegs of this era, such as Royal Albert Hall or Stockholm or Frankfurt at Münster in Germany, suggest that Jimi was using a germanium fuzz. So this is my personal assumption. Listening to these sounds and knowing how the sound and how these fuzzes feel, I'd say it's definitely a germanium fuzz that he was using, but he was using a modded germanium fuzz because in most of these recordings the fuzz was working pretty well with the wah-wah pedal. As I mentioned before, Jimi started preferring silicon fuzzes for their temperature, stability, consistent performance, and of course of the higher gain available. His germanium fuzzes could be unpredictable, causing tone changes during gigs. One of the most famous fuzzes Jimi Hendrix ever used is his red fuzz with the white Stratocaster knobs on it. Photo research shows that Jimi used this red fuzz with the white knobs already during his appearance at the Newport Pop Festival in June of 1969. Guitarists associate this fuzz more with Jimi's legendary appearance at the Woodstock Festival in August 1969, where Jimi also introduced the Univibe for the first time. And the introduction of the Univibe really marks another important step in Jimi's sound, because the always-on preamp of the Univibe gave certain different layers to Jimi Hendrix's live sound. And Roger Mayer stated many times that the red fuzz with the white Stratocaster knobs was actually the Axis fuzz. So here's the Axis fuzz again, but this time with the Univibe's preamp activated. And this red fuzz with the white knobs and the Axis circuit was also used at the legendary New Year's Eve's gig in December 1969 of the Band of Gypsies. Up until his gig in Berkeley in May 1970, we see Jimi Hendrix using his red fuzz with the white knobs, the so-called Axis fuzz. However, he couldn't resist the temptation to introduce a new gray-colored fuzz, possibly equipped with TFK BC108C silicon transistors, and the TFK stands for the German company Telefunken. So why the switch? Well, it's unclear. Perhaps it was practicality, or maybe the red one was stolen. Roger Mayer at that time had already been out of the picture for a while, And possibly there were other persons working on Jimi Hendrix's fuzzes. A name like Dave Weyer comes to mind, but that's pure speculation. However, leaving the American mainland in the summer of 1970, Jimi played on the Isle of Maui, he played on the Isle of Wight, and he played his last gig on the Isle of Fehmarn in Germany. And in the pictures taken of these festival gigs, we see this grey fuzz with the black knobs and the black lettering. And the sound of the grey fuzz, and I must underline at this point that I only assume that this fuzz was based on the BC108C silicon transistor. The sound compared to the Axis fuzz was slightly different. So let's have a listen and compare a BC108 fuzz to the Roger Mayer Axis fuzz. So what led me to the assumption that the grey fuzz was built on BC108C silicon transistors? If we take a closer look at the material recorded at the Isle of Wight, we can hear radio interference on the one hand and a slight oscillation between the fuzz and the wah. At that gig, it went so far that Jimi turned off his fuzz for the song All Along the Watchtower because he needed better wah-wah sound. Interestingly, I have found discussions online where people were discussing whether the grey fuzz was BC108Cs or BC183Ls. Well, let's see how the BC183 compares to the BC108 and to the Axis fuzz. And apart from the fuzzes that we have been talking about so far, let's make a quick excursion to the year 1966 and 1968. Back in May 1966, while touring with Curtis Knight, Jimi got his hands on a Maestro fuzz, setting him on the path of guitar effects and feedback experimentations. In May 1968, Jimi played the Miami Pop Festival. And at that festival, he surprised the guitar world, the guitar aficionados, bringing a new pedal on stage. It was the Foxy Lady pedal by Guild. And Guild produced this pedal in cooperation with a company called Mosrite. And at Mosrite, there was a guy working, his name is Mike Matthews. And Mike Matthews later founded Electro-Harmonix, and eventually the Foxy Lady pedal evolved into the iconic Big Muff Triangle fuzz. Mike Matthews was close friends with Jimi and visited Jimi regularly at Electric Lady Studios, where the tracking of the Electric Ladyland album took place mainly throughout 1968. Mike is still firmly convinced that he saw Jimi using his Big Muff Triangle pedal. But it was probably the Foxy Lady pedal that he saw, because the Big Muff still didn't exist at that time. However, here are some Big Muff tones. As we conclude the journey through the evolution of Jimi Hendrix's fuzz pedals, it's clear that his pioneering spirit and sonic experimentation forever changed the world of rock music. If you enjoyed this journey into the fuzz odyssey of Jimi Hendrix, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more Jimi Hendrix related content. Thanks for watching. And until next time, keep on rocking. See you. Bye.